Hello, welcome everyone. This is the International Peace Coalition. This is our 52nd meeting, which means we have officially entered our anniversary. This is one full year of the International Peace Coalition. My name is Anastasia Battle. I'll be your moderator today with my co-moderators, Dennis Speed and Dennis Small. So with that, I'd like to open it up to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is the founder of the Schiller Institute and is the initiator of the International Peace Coalition. Please go ahead, Helga.
Yes, let me say hello to all of you. Obviously, we have an extremely dangerous, escalating strategic situation. And while we are not neglecting the horrible situation in Gaza, and we will have later a video from Professor Boyle, we would like to concentrate today on the escalation of the crisis around Ukraine, because that has an immediate potential to get out of control. Mid last week, that is almost 8 or 9, 10 days ago, there were 3 attacks on Russian radar early warning system installations, one in Armavir, which was damaged, then 2 more, a second one in Armavir and also in Orsk, who both could be repelled by Russian defense systems. But this represents a very serious escalation, given the fact that it is related to the strategic nuclear defense systems of Russia. So we immediately, recognized that this was an extraordinary escalation. So we consulted with a good number of the top military experts, all of them ahead by Ted Postol, who has a very long record of having written the most expertise on this question, and we are very happy to welcome you here today, but also Professor Schreiber, who is a distinct German military professor and expert and writer of many articles on the topic, as well as Swiss analyst Bosshard, who also is here with us today. So this represents a clear escalation. And, we put out an early warning press release from the Schiller Institute trying to mobilize many more people around the world. And eventually it broke into the so-called mainstream media, but it is still not getting the attention which it deserves. And therefore, we will hear the experts' opinion on this subject today. Now, this was followed by another extremely concerning development, and that is that President Biden apparently gave the permission to the Ukrainians to use the US-delivered weapon systems to Ukraine to strike into the territory of Russia, not too deep into Russian territory and strategic targets, but to those airports from which supposedly the airplanes and rockets are launched, which are hitting Ukraine. Now, supposedly this is limited to the area across the border from Kharkov, but that is an absurd idea, because once you start this process, it is an escalation all the way. And basically, as the reason given by, attributed to Biden by Politico and other papers, was that the situation for the Ukrainians on the battlefield is worsening. Now, just think about it for a second. The Ukraine is losing the war, and therefore the United States is escalating. I mean, that does not make any sense. And that is exactly the condition which Harald Kujat had warned already August last year, where he said NATO will soon be in the decision to make the decision of either go for a diplomatic solution or escalate. And what we have seen is an escalation all the way. Now, unfortunately, Chancellor Scholz, who, against pressure from Cameron and Macron and various other people in Europe, had to a certain extent been holding out by resisting to escalate, not very much, but at least a little bit, by not agreeing to the delivery of the Taurus cruise missiles, and by basically not allowing the Ukrainians to use the German weapon systems for attacks against Russia. Now, on Thursday evening, that is yesterday evening, Scholz still spoke at the Catholic Church Day, which is taking place in Erfurt right now, the annual event. And he, in the context of a citizen dialogue yesterday evening, said that he would not agree that the Ukrainians can use the German-delivered systems to attack Russia. This morning, all of a sudden, he agreed because Biden agreed, and Germany is now a part of it. So former President of Russia, Medvedev, commented on all of that and said the way the Ukrainian conflict is developing is the worst case scenario. The West must get it. The military hardware and the military advisors, so-called, will, in Ukraine, but also in other countries where they are deployed from, will all be eliminated if the attack originates from these countries. And he also noted that, which everybody else knows, that Kiev is controlled by NATO military personnel, that they do not have the independent capability to launch such attacks like on Armavir and Orsk, and that therefore, what Medvedev expresses is that this will not be regarded as, quote, military support, but as war participation, and that will make the countries of those participating in this subject to casus belli, a condition of casus belli. Now, it is generally expected that Russia, with the attacks on the radar systems, de facto, and we will hear the experts to invite them to comment on this, but the big danger is that the condition whereby the Russian nuclear doctrine will go in effect, because it hits targets which are designed to have an early warning against a possible attack on Russia, that therefore the condition of the Russian nuclear doctrine going into effect is already given. Now, when President Putin just visited Central Asia, he made a press conference in Tashkent, where he reacted to statements made by leaders from the Baltic countries, like the leader of Estonia, Kallas, said that NATO must act to force Russia down to its knees, which is a pretty bellicose language for a country which has about 2 or 3 million inhabitants. And that is exactly what Putin was picking up in this press conference in Tashkent, where he said, that basically these countries should think about, what it means to take on a nuclear power with a population of 2 million. So I think that we are in an extremely escalated situation. And, if you then add what is happening around the reaction of Israel to the ICJ and the ICC ruling, namely none, and you see the continued efforts to expand to global NATO in the Pacific, with the conflict of China looming, it is very clear that we are on a trajectory which is risking the existence of civilization if we don't stop it. And therefore, we want to reiterate our call to, absolutely stop this escalation, go for a diplomatic solution in all three cases, at least concerning Ukraine. There is the proposal by China and Brazil on the table, which is a much more reasonable proposal than the Swiss conference, which did not even invite Russia. And we absolutely have to really support internationally that a diplomatic solution is being put on the table, because if this thing goes wrong, it may be Armageddon for all of civilization. So I want to leave it at this and give the word back to you.
Thank you very much, Helga. This is incredibly important that we're bringing everybody together today. I'm very honored to bring on Dr. Professor Theodore Postel, who is a professor emeritus of science, technology, and national security at MIT. And I would say probably the leading nuclear weapons expert, possibly in the world, but very high-ranking nuclear weapons expert. And I'd like to invite you, Ted Postel, to speak. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try to be, of course, brief. I understand there's a lot of other people discussing things, but at the same time, I'd like to provide you with some very basic information that will help you visualize the situation with regard to the early warning problem. As Helga pointed out, the early warning radars at Armavir and Orsk were attacked by drones, Ukrainian drones, and it does not appear that the Orsk radar suffered significant damage, at least as far as we can tell. But the Armavir radars, and there are two of them there, did suffer significant damage, and hopefully the damage can be repaired quickly, and so those radars can be brought back into operation. Now, if the United States had lost an early warning radar that performs the function that the radars at Armavir perform, we, the United States, would be able to look down from space with satellites we have, and we could see if there were missiles being launched from anywhere in the world that would be taking advantage of the radar being lost at that moment. Unfortunately, the Russians do not have such a capability. There's a long and detailed story about how I discovered this. It's been reconfirmed many times. And unfortunately, it has not yet changed, although there is some indication that possibly it will be changing in the next few years. There will be finally some satellites launched that may be able to do the job. We don't know enough about them yet, but we do know that they are supposed to go into what are called geosynchronous orbits. And if they are designed to look down, which we are not yet sure of, then the Russians will have this capability, and the whole world will be much safer. I want to underscore that the lack of a Russian capability in this area jeopardizes the security of the whole world. The radars at Armavir there are two radars that, can I get the first slide, please? There you go, thank you. The two radars at Armavir the slide I'm showing you shows the radar fans of three radars. There are two radar fans on the left side of your screen that are overlapping slightly at the middle. And those are the radars at Armavir. Each look into an azimuth of about 120 degrees. So between the two radars, you can cover an azimuth of about 240 degrees. To the right is the radar fan at Orsk, and that's also a 120-degree fan. And as you can see, there's what I call a ground shadow underlying the radar fans. And that simply shows you where on the Earth's surface, if a rocket is launched against, for example, Moscow, it would break the radar fan. Keep in mind that the radar fans in some locations are hundreds of kilometers above the location on the Earth that I call the ground shadow. So it will take them time to climb to an altitude where they break into the surveillance fan of those radars. Now, if you had satellites in space, let's concentrate for the moment on the Indian Ocean. Those satellites could tell essentially immediately, if they were looking down, they could tell essentially immediately that something was launched at Moscow if the Russians had this satellite. They don't have this capability. So the best they can do is start seeing objects once they rise into the radar fan of the radars. These radar fans are limited. In this case, the distance shown in the radar fans is just simply to make the graphics easier to understand. They're actually longer range than the fans that are shown here. If we look at the next slide, we can get a sense of why of the timelines that that the radars give. So, for example, if you look at the radar fan that is colored yellow, and then you look at the trajectories these are real trajectories. They're calculated according to the laws of physics. You could see that the points are at 1 minute intervals. So if you look at the far left side, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 6 minutes after launch, you would begin to travel through the radar fan that is forward of Moscow. This particular radar fan is placed about 1,000 kilometers forward of Moscow. It's not exact relative to the fans at Armavir and Orsk, but it generally is good enough for illustrating the issues. So if you had the satellites in space, you could see the launch of the missile essentially at the left origin of the graph, because you would immediately tell from looking down in space that you could see the bright exhaust plume of the rocket, and you would know for 5 or 6 minutes before the radar fan picked up the incoming missiles that you were under attack. And that's important. 5 or 6 minutes is a very short time. Now, in the case of losing these radar fans, I've shown a second radar fan that's colored red. And that is a fan, those are fans that come from radars that are actually in Moscow, very big, long-range radars that are in Moscow itself. So you can see that 3 or 4 minutes after the radar fan, the forward radar fans, let's say at Armavir, would see an incoming set of rockets attacking, you would then see them on from the radars in Moscow. Of course, if the yellow radar fan is not there because the radar is not operating, then the decision-making time, or the warning time, is compressed by 2 or 3 minutes. Keep in mind that when an object enters this radar fan that I've depicted on this screen, it takes some time, perhaps a second or two, for the radar to collect enough energy to detect the incoming target, the rocket that's coming in. And then it takes another few seconds for it to track the object long enough that it can draw a straight line through the different points and then estimate where the object is going, that it's in fact going to Moscow in this case. So, so time is consumed in every step of the operation. Now, if I show you the third slide, the
I think there is.
I've just put together a notional time for the amount of time left for decision making that is required by decision makers. So, for example, in the top row, I say time for attacking missiles to rise over the horizon into the line of sight of the early warning radar. It might take a minute. It might take you that long. Another minute to just characterize that the targets are missiles coming in, know what they are. So 2 minutes are consumed there. A military and civil command conference, let's ignore that for the moment, because that's an American process. It may not, the Russians will have their own system. Time for command and unit elements of the silo-based forces to react to a launch order, 2 to 4 minutes. That again is a number for an American system. Time for missile crews to go through a full launch procedure, 1 to 3 minutes. That's going to be the same for Russians and Americans. And then we have time for the missiles to launch from their silos. They have to get far enough away from their silos because, and it takes a minute or two, because if warheads are detonating on the ICBM silo fields, the blast waves from those warheads, even though they're relatively low pressure, if the missiles in the sky, the ICBMs will be destroyed. So they have to be flying out. You know, they have to get out of the air atmosphere above the silo fields. So these are the timelines that the Russians will certainly have in mind. So if you have 5 minutes consumed, and it's much more likely to be 7 or 8 minutes, the timelines can be easily no more than 7 or 8 minutes if they're using only the radars in Moscow. So this means that the Russian political leadership might have less than a few minutes to make a decision on whether or not to launch their forces. Now, we don't know what the Russians, there are lots of people who claim to know, but I don't know. And I know that other people don't know what they claim to know. We really don't know what the Russians have chosen to do to deal with this situation. It's very likely that the Russians have made plans to assure that the launch of their missiles occurs by one means or another. This could mean what was called pre-delegated authority. So under certain conditions, and those conditions are determined by human decision makers and circumstances, these launches could be done in an automated fashion. So the loss of 2 or 3 minutes in the warning system is very serious and very critical. So this is not something that should be taken lightly. Now, I don't want to take too much time on this. We're going to have some very knowledgeable military people like Colonel Black speaking and others. So I will not take any more time here, although I am very happy to talk in more detail about the military issues if there's a role for me to play here. But I prefer that the military experts talk, although I can add important technical details if people would like to hear about them. And we'll leave it for the question and answer period and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted Postal. This was incredibly enlightening and really puts a lot of emphasis on us getting this out. In fact, I would suggest that we just take this clip of what you did, if that's okay with you, and we can distribute that around social media. That's fine. Thank you.
If people want the slides, I can send them to them. Just send it to postal@mit.edu. Please put a header on, because I'm inundated with emails. Just say, please send early warning slides, and I will do that.
Thank you for that. I'd like to ask if Helga, you had a response, if you have a response to TED Postal.
Well, no, I think it's extremely important that, you know, you provide this information, because, you know, the flabbergasting question is, how can politicians play with something which, you know, I'm sure that many European leaders know about that, but they still do the things which bring on the potential catastrophe.
Yeah.
So if you can provide us with any help, you know, to wake up those decision makers, it would be extremely helpful.
Yes, let me just add one very, very important point. You should not assume that the political decision makers understand this serious problem with the Russian early warning system. It has been my experience with people in the White House that they do not know about these details. They are almost completely focused on politics, and they have they typically have limited technical training, and there's a real problem between the intelligence community and communicating with people at the highest levels in the White House. And every time there's a change of administration or people change their jobs, anything that someone might have actually learned in their office gets lost. And I'm quite sure this is the situation in Europe as well. So you should not assume that these supposedly wise and well-informed people actually know anything about this. This is an extremely important point that I emphasize with the strongest concern.
Thank you. We will hopefully be able to call on your advice for the coming mobilization.
I'll be here.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll actually start going through some of the military experts. Next, I would like to ask retired Colonel and Professor Dr. Wilfried Schreiber, who is a senior research fellow at the Welt Trends Institute for International Politics in Germany. If you are there, please go ahead, Schreiber. Yeah.
Yeah, I will speak in German. I was for 35 years soldier in the GDR, and the last 10 years I was a high school teacher in Rostock, if I'm not mistaken. I can say that the question of war and peace was the main question in my whole life. And I have still a remembrance at the Second World War. At the end of the war, I was 8 years old. And I realized all of the air attacks in Dresden. I survived it. I have to admit that the remembrance of the war is almost lost in Germany now. But at that time, both armies from the GDR and from Western Germany had were clear that we are talking about the really serious question with war and peace, and that was basically uniting. over the borders. I remember that in the year 1988, we had a conference with a scientific council.
Well, I think there is a basic rule.
With a scientific council in Berlin. And the topic was that both German states were not war ready at that time in 1988. Both German states and all the Middle European states in general are not in a shape to fight a big war. Since then, it is 36 years ago, and the things have not changed to the better. There are changes in respect to not being able to fight a war. I want to highlight here. First of all, Germany and the neighbors of Germany are really not resilient because they are really because of the electricity, they are really easy to hurt, because if there's no water, no electricity, no radio, no television, no power at all, nothing works. If a country has to go through such a period for 1 week, that would be a total chaos. Only in the last days, I saw an article in Deutsche Wirtschaftsnachrichten where it was explained that even if there is only a short blackout, would do economic damage of huge dimensions. A second point, in these 36 years, there are developed new destructive ways to use technologies to destroy another country. We have just heard from Ted Postol the possibilities of space technologies. We have digitalization, a process which opens a totally new horizon in war policies, in terms of cyberspace warfare. And if I think about communications, to use electromagnetic waves, pulses, then I have to realize that this is a new quality of warfare. And thirdly, we have to highlight that during the Cold War, the value system of weapons control systems has been dismantled, and it is not existent anymore. Therefore, as a result, I can say the dangers of escalation are rising rapidly.
So we are in front of losing control. So I come to the end of my presentation with the words, this insanity must be stopped. The military confrontation between NATO and Russian Federation must be stopped at all costs, because this is all about the existence of Europe. And I say, especially Europe, because Europe is more or less an island, and Russia is a huge area which has 1/7 of the Earth's land mass. So the biggest concentration of war would be in Middle Europe. That must not happen. That is what our politics should do, and not do the do more escalation. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Schreiber. This is a very important addition to the discussion. Next, I'd like to ask Lieutenant Colonel retired Ralph Bosshard of the Swiss Armed Forces. He's a consultant of military strategic affairs. Please go ahead.
Welcome. Hello from Switzerland. Apart from having served as a full-time professional officer in the Swiss Armed Forces, which is not very impressive, I guess I have been trained in the West, in Britain, as well as in Russia, and I've attended the General Staff Officers Training Course of the Russian Federation. So I know quite a lot of the guys that we are talking about sitting in Moscow, including, of course, classmates from the strategic missile forces of the Russian Federation, etc., etc. And since I've been working for the OSCE in Vienna on the conflicts in Ukraine and Nagorno-Karabakh, I'm used to considering things from either side, and I'll give it a try now. In this particular situation, as I can, of course, see what the Russians are feeling like. And for the Russians, it looks as if the West's goal was to use Ukraine's willingness to take military action against Russia to launch a campaign to weaken Russia militarily. Maybe the West has seen it as a kind of win-win situation to help Ukraine take revenge on Russia for the loss of Crimea and the Donbass, while at the same time providing a platform to carry out strikes against Russia that they in the West would not dare to carry out from their proper territory. And I guess that they have promised Vladimir Zelensky that he would be richly rewarded for his cooperation. And it looks as if the West believed in its own press releases, and particularly in Ukraine's big-mouthed promises that its victory over Russia was possible and imminent. But since the loss of Avdiivka, northwest of Donetsk, where I happened to be a couple of times, the front in Donbass has slept, and it is hardly to foresee when it will be stabilized again. At the moment, it seems that the Russians have forced the Ukrainians to use their last reserves with their attack in the Kharkov Oblast, and they are now free to launch similar attacks towards Sumy, towards Chernihiv, maybe, I don't know. And from the Russian point of view, what happens in the West now, all the discussions that have been conducted, look a wee bit like due to panic. The war is now, I think, in a phase in which a defeat of Ukraine can only be averted by massive strikes against strategic targets in Russia. At least, I guess that's the perception in the West. In general, a situation has arisen in which the West can no longer influence the development of the situation in Europe, as well as in the Middle East and in the Southern Caucasus, by the way, as well, without making concessions to Russia, which he is, of course, not prepared to do. the attack on the Russian early warning radar Voronezh in Armavir was an attempt to achieve two goals at the same time, I guess, reducing the reconnaissance capabilities of Russia and those of Iran as well. And I remember with the attacks, of course, of Iran carried out against targets in southern Israel, which have shown that Iran obviously is no longer afraid of possible retaliatory strikes. And unfortunately, the situation in the Middle East is even more volatile than it has been, than it's been here, and than it has been before. It seems to me that politicians in the West, are apparently unaware of the risk they are taking, and they're now chanting that Putin is just bluffing. Believe me, the Russians are in a self-defense mode now. They have a firm belief that they are up in a war against not Ukraine, but the entire NATO and the West as a whole. And now, of course, with this discussion and this panic on Putin is the one who can put an end to this chicken game. And I particularly hate that those politicians are playing the chicken game with the population of Europe as a whole, even those who would never voluntarily join such a game. But what makes me calm down a wee bit is the fact that Russia has a few options using conventional means outside the territory of NATO states. The fact that the Houthis apparently tried to attack a US aircraft carrier tells me what the possible options would be. And of course, these options are not limited to US assets. And at the time being, Russia is still operating successfully in Ukraine. So Putin can remain calm for the time being. And it seems to be that in order to retain a certain amount of credibility, or to remain credible entirely, NATO will be the side that soon has to threaten Russia with the use of nuclear weapons and not the other way around. I think we are making ourselves illusions on that topic here as well. So much from Switzerland, not very optimistic. Thanks for listening, and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much for joining us. This has been an excellent lineup so far. Very much appreciate your input to this discussion. Next, I'd like to ask retired Colonel Richard Black, who is the former head of the U.S. Army Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon. If you could please, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anastasia. Where we are right now is President Biden recognizes that the Ukraine project is collapsing. He views the situation that if Ukraine falls before the election, it could spell disaster for his political party, for his chances of re-election. Now, since Russia's involvement in the Ukraine war began in 2022, the White House has frequently acted very recklessly in doing things that conceivably could provoke an out-of-control escalation. You go back in time, very early on, the United States used its surveillance resources to assist in targeting 13 Russian generals for assassination. They were being killed right and left in the early days. We were involved in the sinking of the Russian flagship Moskva And that resulted, this was a cruiser, it's not a small ship, and that resulted in the death of 300 young Russian sailors who all went to the bottom with the ship. Most egregious, most wildly reckless was the blowing up of Europe's vital Nord Stream pipelines, which were sort of the lifeline of the German economy, and yet we took them out. So we have this history of reckless actions being taken, doing things that could conceivably escalate out of control. Unfortunately, President Putin is a very level-headed individual, very calm, and not a person prone to emotional reaction. Now, I don't believe that there has been a decision made for NATO either to directly enter in combat against Russia using its own troops. Although that decision has almost come about because into battle with the French Foreign Legion. More has not been made for NATO, for the United States or NATO to launch any sort of a nuclear first strike, which we both with NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine and with the potential for a nuclear first strike, is that NATO, the Pentagon, they are laying in place the framework for taking actions such as those in the event that the National Command Authority made a decision to go in those directions. Now, yesterday, in a very coordinated action, which involves all of NATO, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use United States weapons to strike targets inside of Russia. Today, Germany and France predictably came out and said, oh yes, we agree with that. So all of NATO is on board. Keep in mind, you always have to remember when talking about NATO, NATO is run by the United States. The Supreme Allied Commander Europe is a 4-star American general. This has been the case since the founding of NATO, and it will continue to be that way in the future. This is a mechanism whereby the United States, ever since the Second World War, has dominated Europe and has managed to maneuver them rather skillfully in a unified way. This was fine when we were talking about NATO being a defensive alliance. The time has long passed since it was defensive in nature. It has become a very aggressive global military organization, and it's become very aggressive in nature. But in any event, we have this coordinated action to authorize the use of NATO weapons now to actually attack targets within Russia. Now, the New York Times had an analysis of that this morning, where they admitted that the implications of the authorization were clearly much broader than the limited ones that were expressed. Basically, what they said was that these weapons could be used to attack targets inside of Russia, so long as they were relevant to fighting back against troops coming across the border towards Kharkiv, the very large, second largest city in Ukraine. And so President Biden put some limitations. But the New York Times said the implications are clearly much broader. Said until now, Mr. Biden has, and this is, I'm quoting the New York Times, until now, Mr. Biden has flatly refused to let Ukraine use American-made weapons outside of Ukrainian borders, no matter what the provocation, saying that any attack on Russian territory risked violating his mandate to avoid World War III. In other words, this is President Biden's mandate to avoid World War III. He has now said, okay, I'm going to allow our forces to cross that line, and we are willing to risk World War III. And he's not, those are not his words, but it seems to be a part of the thing that he is expressing here. So President Biden has reached a point where he is now willing to take the chance on World War III breaking out. It's not at all clear that he has any intent to make that happen or to encourage it, but he is increasingly willing to take a very significant chance that something might happen. Now, I don't want you to get the impression that the United States has genuinely prohibited Ukraine from using American weapons to launch long-range attacks within Russia, because that's not the case. We have secretly green-lighted Ukraine's long-range attacks inside Russia. We see this with the 3 separate drone attacks against the early warning system. Now, the actual drones that they used were not American drones, but these attacks would not be happening without explicit American approval. Now, in addition to that, now keep in mind what we're talking about. These are not small radar systems. These are strategic, massive radar systems, and they are part of this attack by with nuclear weapons launched by either the United States or other NATO powers. Now, the attack on very deep targets, these radar targets within Russia, serves no other military purpose than to blind Russia's nuclear deterrence. It's not as though it has some collateral importance related to the battle around Kharkiv or somewhere else on the war. Now, meanwhile, Brookings has reported that Ukraine has repeatedly attacked the Engels Air Base. Now, the Engels Air Base is home to a major portion of Russia's nuclear bomber fleet, part of their nuclear triad, which they have just like the United States has. It provides the ability to respond to a nuclear attack by having a variety of layers of response. And the Ukrainians have actually managed to take out some of the nuclear bomber fleet. And just recently, there has been a great deal of tension over the final decision to introduce F-16 nuclear-capable jets into Ukraine. The pilots' training is completed. The planes are now ready to move in. The exact date when they arrive is not clear, but it's very, very close. So what we see is this movement of forces all converging in a fashion that suggests preparation for a nuclear strike by the US and NATO. Now, what I'm telling you is that I don't know what our ultimate intentions are, but from the Russian side, they have to analyze and draw conclusions from what they see. They see their deterrents being blinded. They see their bombers being knocked out. They see nuclear capable attack jets being moved into Ukraine, potentially in preparation to launch an attack. Now, this makes it very important to analyze the U.S. doctrine versus the Russian doctrine for the use of nuclear weapons and the response. Now, the United States does not have any prohibition on the first use of nuclear weapons. There's nothing that prohibits the United States sneak attack using nuclear weapons. There's nothing in American doctrine that prohibits that we know of. They've been published, but is the ultimate authority on whether we will launch a nuclear attack. On the other hand, the Russian nuclear doctrine is exclusively defensive. Now, it does allow the use of nuclear weapons in very limited circumstances in a defensive mode. In other words, if they know that the other side is about to launch a nuclear act, they can preempt that. Now, most importantly, the Russian nuclear doctrine allows the use of nuclear weapons to respond to any attack aimed at crippling its nuclear forces. That requirement has already been fulfilled. We see actions taken that certainly can be interpreted as a coordinated act to cripple the nuclear defenses of Russia. Now, we know that the Russians have reason to fear a nuclear Pearl Harbor. Early on in the war, Senator Roger Wiker, Republican of Mississippi, who is the second-ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee, was talking about various responses that we might use to block Russia from coming across into Ukraine. And among other things, he said, we don't rule out the first use of nuclear action. Now, that's a direct quote from Senator Wiker. Now, it is true that this was an accurate statement of American nuclear doctrine, but for a key political figure to make that a part of his dialogue with the press was a rather shocking thing to occur. We reported on that back when it happened. So from Russia's perspective, they see this very unstable situation evolving within the United States. They see an American doctrine which is aggressive rather than defensive, and they have to make decisions. And as we have heard earlier, the decisions have to be made in extremely short order. So that really requires you don't have the time for reflection. You have to go according to standard operating procedure, which is a very dangerous thing to have happen. Now, there are certainly many Americans who are of the interventionist mode, who believe that maybe the time has come, maybe we should use nuclear weapons, maybe we could just slam these Russians and put them in their place. I think, I would hope that people would understand that we do not have the ability to preemptively destroy all of Russia's nuclear defenses. I hope people will come to grips with that. If we were to launch a massive, all-out, coordinated nuclear attack on Russia, we could certainly destroy Russian civilization. But we do not have the ability to destroy all of their nuclear defenses. Keep in mind, they have 11 nuclear submarines at sea. These are carrying a very minimum of 700 powerful nuclear missiles with a hair trigger response time. And these are lying off the coast of the United States and off of the European capitals. Keep in mind then that if something were to break out, whether it's accidental or whether it's a deliberate attack, that you will see the city of New York turned into molten glass. You will see Northern Virginia, the Pentagon, turned into molten glass. You will see the same thing in Berlin, in Paris, in Stockholm, in Oslo, in so many European capitals. They will be destroyed. Perhaps there will be many people who will survive. Certainly they would be, but the power centers of the Western world would be destroyed for all practical purposes. Now, the more anxious the White House becomes about the upcoming elections, the failure of the legal strategy that they've employed to destroy Biden's opponent in the election, the more nervous they become and the greater the risk of a very high risk military gambit. It's important that everyone understand that the Ukraine project is of immense importance to the transatlantic alliance. Ukraine was never a vital national interest of the United States, but NATO has decided to stake its very existence on winning this war. They will not go down quietly. The risk of nuclear war is increasing rather dramatically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Richard Black. It's always a pleasure to have you on this meeting, and your contributions are very vital to understanding what's going on in the world. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to ask, we have a video from former Ambassador Charles Freeman, who was a US-China diplomat and scholar. Could we pull up that video, please?
Well, I think there is a basic rule of statecraft in the nuclear age, and that is that no great nuclear power can afford to appear to be undermining the nuclear deterrent or the strategic defense of a rival. And yet, that is exactly what Ukraine, apparently acting as a proxy for the United States, is doing. It is attacking the Russian early warning system, which is an integral part of Russia's nuclear deterrent. This is a strategic assault on Russia, and it will probably draw a strategic reaction. The fact that we have not seen a particular action from the Russians to date is not reassuring. It probably represents the deliberations in Moscow about how to respond without starting World War III, which is not an impossible outcome if this strategic rivalry continues uncontrolled. So this is a very serious development. It has, as you indicated, all the earmarks of a systematic effort to undermine Russian strategic security. Two attacks, two sites. I believe, I may be poorly informed, that there are 10 such sites protecting Moscow. This represents an effort to knock out 20% of Russia's early warning system. It is not insignificant. I also understand that unlike the United States, which relies heavily on satellite spaceborne detection systems, the Russians are heavily dependent on these ground stations. So that the net effect of eliminating these is to reduce warning time very substantially, leaving the Russian leadership with almost no time to make a decision about how to respond to a detected possible attack. This is particularly alarming because there have been in the past mistaken detections of such attacks, and it has only been the actions of responsible officials on the Russian side, given the time to deliberate, that has prevented them from responding to a perceived nuclear attack with their own counterattack on the United States and other targets. The most remarkable thing, reflecting the strategic complacency and lack of intelligence of much of the West, is the extent to which this danger has not been identified in the mainstream media. I know that your own executive intelligence review has, and the Schiller Institute have issued a warning and covered this issue carefully. But that is not true of the mainstream media, which suggests a level of military and strategic illiteracy on the part of the current crop of journalists that is quite frightening. Well, I think it's almost inevitable when a smaller country goes up against a much larger one with a heavier population and a much larger potential armed force, that in a war of attrition, the smaller country will lose. So from the very beginning, those of us who followed this situation closely were deeply concerned that the United States and NATO had set up Ukraine for a catastrophe. And that catastrophe has indeed now begun to unfold in its final stage. What we don't know, given the Russian advances in the east and the south, and the difficulty the Ukrainians are having in holding on to basically unprepared defensive positions in many cases, is whether Mr. Putin and the Russians will now move the goalposts. They have, in fact, been fairly restrained and consistent in stating their goals, which have been to protect the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, to achieve a return to Ukrainian neutrality. Ukraine was neutral when it became independent. That was an important condition for global dealings with it. And finally, to achieve a negotiation with NATO and the United States on a security architecture for Europe that threatens neither Russia nor the rest of Europe, that eliminates concerns about the Russian threat while eliminating Russia's concerns about NATO enlargement and expansion, which has invariably been followed by the stationing of American troops and weaponry on the soil of new members. So I think we've seen the Russians hold to those positions. Mr. Putin now says apparently he is ready for a negotiation, resumption of negotiations, which were broken off in early 2022 at the insistence of the West. But we see no receptivity on the Western side to any such process of peace talks.
In fact, you find many voices in Europe and the US who are saying, admitting that we're losing, or we, meaning, Ukraine is losing, and therefore we should escalate. We should send in NATO troops. We should allow them to go ahead and use their long-range missiles to attack sites in Russia. This, you would think, would be obvious as something that would lead very quickly to a global war, even a nuclear war.
Well, that is, of course, the case. And we have seen pressure on Ukraine from neoconservatives to escalate against Russia. And we are reminded that the stated objective of this war, from the point of view of the United States, has nothing to do with Ukraine and everything to do with weakening and isolating Russia. That has not happened. The opposite has happened. Russia has reoriented itself toward China, India, the Middle East, and Africa, and away from Europe. And its military production has surged. Its economy has boomed. It now has, in purchasing power terms, a larger economy than Germany, and is the largest European economy. So these are all failures. They were anticipatable, I think, but they were not anticipated. And so now we have almost desperate, panicked advocacy of further escalation, despite the fact that every escalation we have conducted, and there have been many, has been countered by counter-escalation from Russia, which has just added to the destruction in Ukraine. The Ukrainian power grid, power plants, infrastructure, industrial base are all now being ground to bits as a result of Ukraine's extension of the war into remote locations in Russia. Some of them very far from Ukraine, and these not related to anything the Russians are doing in Ukraine, but rather to Russia's ability to defend itself against a strategic assault by the United States. Now, I don't think the United States has any desire to assault Russia directly, but I don't believe that the Russians can take us at our word on that. I don't think we would take them at their word if they made statements comparable to those coming from American politicians.
I'd just like to extend my gratitude to Ambassador Freeman for his contribution today, and this interview will be published shortly, if not already, on the Schiller Institute site. And I look forward to his future participation in this International Peace Coalition discussion. Before we continue, I'd just like to ask Helga if she would like to respond to anything that was stated so far.
Yes, I just would like to add as a comment to especially what Charles Freeman just said about the illiteracy of the common crop of journalists. I think it's even worse, because it is not just incompetence or neglect or lack of knowledge. I think we are looking at a situation where the mass media is absolutely in the hands of those who are pushing the confrontation. I should add that there are 4 heads of state in Europe who are warning that Europe is preparing a war against Russia, most notably Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, the Prime Minister of Georgia, Kovačić, the President of Serbia, Vučić, and naturally Prime Minister Fico, who was, there was an assassination attempt 2 weeks ago. Fortunately, he survived it, but the Slovakian authorities are investigating right now what is the background, and they have come to the conclusion that it was not a lone assassin, but that there are various groups. It's altogether 48 individuals are being investigated for their potentially international links. So I just want to add that you know, we are, when I think Senator Black talked about the reckless behavior, I think, you know, we are also looking at you know, that work, and we have published a documentation about it, which I would like all participants who are interested in to, we will list it in the chat, because there is actually, you know, death lists being published since quite a while of people who are daring to call for peace. You know, and as people at this present program can see, you know, we are not pushing war, we are pushing diplomatic solution. And if that is enough to end up on kill lists, then you get a sense of how far this has gone.
Thank you, Helga. I just posted that dossier in the chat right now, which I highly suggest that people read this, study it, use it. It's very important that we get this out in order to protect the people like who you're seeing on this discussion today to be able to speak out. So thank you very much, Helga, for that. I'd like to go next to Diane Sayre, who is a US Senate candidate in New York State, and she has just filed her 45,000 signatures to the state in order to be an independent candidate on the ballot. Are you there, Diane?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Let me just say that we didn't file 45,000 signatures, although that's the requirement, but closer to 70,000. And that does give me some authority to speak about what is happening with the American population and the dynamic here. I trust I can be heard. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Look, we are in a presidential election year in the United States. And you would think at such a moment that the American people would be intimately involved in the debate as to whether we are going to annihilate ourselves in a thermonuclear war or not. But instead, we have a pornographic, infantile spectacle of a presidential election where a former president has been put on trial and convicted of paying a prostitute out of the wrong bank account, and an incumbent president who was found to be not mentally fit enough to stand trial, but he is okay to have a decision about whether we're going to have a nuclear war. And I can tell you that in order to get these close to 70,000 signatures, I and Jose Vega, my colleague with Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche slate, who also got on the ballot in the 15th Congressional District in the Bronx, probably spoke with 300,000 people. In my case, we were distributing a little bookmark, which I'm hoping you can see. On the one side, it's myself and Jose. On the other side, it says, "Let us beat swords into plowshares." And it has a quote from Lyndon LaRouche, whose witch hunt and railroading case is the reason why today you can't get a qualified candidate for president of the United States. The quote from LaRouche was right after 9/11, where he makes the point that wars for the purpose of revenge or retribution are the most stupid policies any government or its people have ever conducted, that the blowback of such wars inevitably destroys the nation running them, and says, let us stop being stupid now. Now, the fact that we met so many people, and we met people who wouldn't sign, who said, what do you stand for? And I would say, peace. And they would say, what? Well, I don't know. I mean, don't you think I'm for peace, but some wars are really necessary? I mean, we really have to help Ukraine, right? Or the people who didn't want to help Ukraine, well, we have to stand by Israel. Now, I'm happy to say I did get one honest response when I said I'm for peace, and the person said, oh, well, I'm for Israel. So at least they knew that was not synonymous with being for peace. On the other hand, we did get these between us 85,000 signatures or so. So clearly there is hope for the situation to be moved. But I would say we have to quickly create in the United States and in the West in general a stronger connection to the paradigm of the BRICS Plus, what Helga herself has been calling for in terms of a new strategic architecture. The fact that this actually is emerging, that this is what Lyndon LaRouche was working on his entire adult life and has been picked up by China, Russia, Brazil. And what I think is very important about these nations is what is uniform about them? Their language, their religion, their form of government, virtually nothing. But they find that they can come together in a common interest for their mutual benefit, for the advancement of mankind. That was something that the American people used to believe in. So I just would say that my intention, our intention here in the United States, is we have to bring the American people into the debate. That's the other thing I wanted to report. They would say, all right, you're for peace. What does that mean? And I would say, well, I don't think we should have a nuclear war. And they would say, nobody wants a nuclear war, do they? Well, I don't know about that. Some people think we can win a nuclear war. Some people think, and we heard it a few months ago, that there was such a thing as launching a disarming first strike against Russia, which would somehow magically make them incapable of responding to an American attack. So these delusions need to be shattered. The American people have a moral obligation to be involved in this process and to, rather than acting like 2-year-olds in a sandbox, to realize that they have to have a voice in the critical issues of the day, that the election coming up here in November should already be apparently a referendum on whether we're going to plunge to thermonuclear war or peace. And the media is not allowing that. And then the last thing I would just say, of course, people remember John Brennan, who was the head of the CIA, is now an anchorman at MSNBC. So, of course, the American mainstream media is not even secretly, but very openly an arm of the intelligence agencies and the financial interests that are plunging us toward the abyss. So I think it's a very dire situation. I intend that we are going to defeat it, and hopefully we'll be in a position some years from now to laugh at the unbelievable stupidity that we are witnessing at the moment. But I think for now, it's extremely dangerous, and I just wanted to give a little picture of the kind of dynamic in the United States and the shift that has to be made here.
I think what we should do is go to the prepared video from Professor Francis Boyle, who again sends his regrets to not be able to be with us today. He's has a million other commitments. but he did send a video, which we think is very important to post for you right now. Go right ahead, Dave.
Thank you very much for having me here today. Sorry I cannot appear live, but I have other commitments Friday morning. I first want to address these indictments by the International Criminal Court of Netanyahu and Gallant. My response is better late than never. In 2009, after Operation Cast Lead exterminated about 1,500 Palestinians, I advised Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which he did for Palestine and the Palestinians. Until last week, the ICC prosecutor, 3 of them, had not lifted one finger to help the Palestinians. Not one finger. If they had started to indict some of these Israeli civilian and military officials 15 years ago, maybe all of this could have been prevented. I really don't know. That's a counterfactual of history. But at least the prosecutor did indict Netanyahu and Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Personally, given the world court orders already on the books, they should also have been indicted for genocide. In addition, normally these indictments follow the military chain of command, which in this case was Netanyahu, Gallant, and it should have been Chief of Staff Halevi. I have no idea why the Chief of Staff was not on there, but he should be on the list. Right now, the indictments have been submitted to an ICC panel of 3 judges to consider the evidence and if they agree to return the warrants. The prosecutor has not released the evidence, but fine if you read all of the written submissions by the Republic of South Africa to the International Court of Justice in their 4 requests for provisional measures of protection. And if you watch the proceedings in 2 oral rounds, the evidence is there. And indeed, if you look at the evidence, you'll see South Africa was very careful to document its sources from United Nations sources. Generally speaking, the International Court of Justice will give judicial notice to any facts established by a United Nations source. So the evidence is there. As we know, however, from the report from the Guardian, the Israeli government, the American government, Zionists all over the world are putting enormous pressure right now as we speak upon these 3 judges not to return those warrants. I'm sure it's bribery, threaten, intimidation, blackmail against the 3 judges, their families, and the governments that appointed them. So we will have to see if those warrants are returned. I don't know, I can't say, but I know this is going on right now as we speak. That being said, however, Netanyahu and Gallant are now indicted international criminals under the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. There are 124 state parties to the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, and many of them have domestic implementing legislation making Rome Statute crimes domestic crimes. Generally speaking, certainly here in the United States, Britain for sure, You cannot indict someone on the basis of a treaty alone. You need domestic implementing legislation. So it very well could be the case today that even without the warrants, the fact that Netanyahu and Gallant are now indicted international war criminals could be proceeded against under the domestic implementing legislation for some of these 124 Rome Statute states. Working with Swiss NGOs, we were able to scare Bush Jr. out of giving a lecture in Geneva on the basis of the Swiss domestic implementing legislation for the Rome Statute. Finally, let me say a word. The World Court order just came down. After 4 times of trying, the World Court finally got an order to Israel to cease and desist its military operation, quote, by 13 votes to 2, immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah. Israel doubled down by the attacking the refugees, the tent fire, and is continuing right now. Israel stands in violation now of 3 World Court orders and 1 decision, basically to cease and desist from committing all acts of genocide against the Palestinians. Many states have domestic implementing legislation for the Genocide Convention. We should be applying them to the highest level officials of the Israeli government. Likewise, as argued by Nicaragua, Israel is in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. All states have an obligation to respect and to ensure respect for the terms of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Many states have domestic implementing legislation for the Geneva Conventions, making that crimes. And we also need to be proceeding against the highest level officials of Israel under the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, and the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Well, I sincerely appreciate everyone's presentation, and I had a question for Dr. Postel. I was wanting to see if I properly interpreted a slide about that showed the search fans from the different Russian early warning facilities, and in particular, the ground shadow from the Armavir facility. Does that mean that submarines, U.S. subs in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean would be unable to detect a launch from those if that facility is out of service? I didn't really understand exactly what the ground shadow meant.
Well, if the Armavir radar that is looking toward the Mediterranean, excuse me, if the Armavir radar that's looking toward the Mediterranean, which does appear to have had significant damage, is not operating, then if there were launches from ballistic missile submarines in the Mediterranean, you would not see those warheads coming in or the missiles coming in until they broke the radar fan of the radars in
Moscow.
Moscow. And the situation in Moscow is just to be a little bit more detailed in a way that could be interesting, could be useful to your readers. The most capable radar for tracking in Moscow is a radar called the Don 2, which was part of the Pushkino radar ABM system. And that radar is probably not capable of seeing the warheads at longest range from the missiles. What it would see is the upper rocket stages of the missiles, and then as the warheads and upper rocket stages approached Moscow, it would eventually be able to see the warheads themselves. So it's far from a perfect system. It's, of course, from the point of view of warning, you do have the warning, but of course, the scale of what's going on in front of you is not knowable for even a longer time, a later time. So this is, well, it's obvious it's not a very good situation. In terms of in terms of the fan that looks into the Indian Ocean, the United States has gone out of its way to show that Trident submarines, at least occasionally, operate in the Indian Oceans. They have had a Trident submarine show up at Diego Garcia, which is in the Indian Ocean. And it was obvious why it was there. It was there to show that submarine Tridents can and will patrol in the Indian Ocean. And it's important to understand that a single Trident submarine could destroy Russia, destroy all of Russia. I mean, if you talk about attacks on cities. So a single Trident submarine operating in the Indian Ocean or in the Mediterranean is not a minor issue from the point of view of Russian military planners who have to provide warning and strike capability should that be needed. I'll run to you.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you both for that question and answer. What I recall, Dr. Postel, of the comments that were directed specifically to you was one question from Professor Boyd Barrett about what about the danger of accidental warfare? And then there was another broader one on the issue of biological and chemical warfare as well, if that's in your wheelhouse. Go right ahead.
Well, as Boyd Barrett understands, I have contemplated the possibility of accidental nuclear war essentially during all of my career, including in my career when I was in the Pentagon working as an advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations. So this has been an issue that has been of concern to me right through my career. The problem, let me give you an example of a thought that I've had for really decades. If you were to tell me that the United States and Soviet Union would have a Cold War of the kind we know we have had for decades, and that it did not result in a nuclear war by accident, given all the history of events, I would have told you that almost certainly there would have been a nuclear war. In other words, if I were guessing based on being told that there was going to be this confrontation where both sides were at each other for decades, I would have concluded that the chances of not having a nuclear war were very low because the possibilities are so great. Now, the reason I think, of course I don't know, the reason I think we haven't had a nuclear war is because every politician I have ever dealt with and every political leader or militarily responsible individual, in this case, I'm talking about Russians, Americans, Chinese, because I've worked with the Chinese, every one of these people have been just tremendously afraid of what could happen if nuclear weapons were used, including me, of course. And I think that these people who, unlike me, were in various decision-making roles, have such a reaction against the consequence of a nuclear war that their level of caution skewed the probability of an accident curve well away from decisions that could have led to accidents and escalation. Now, this is not an argument that it will not happen and cannot happen. I'm just saying that if you assumed the kind of probabilistic events that typically lead to accidents, a nuclear war would have occurred, as far as I can tell. But we've so far been lucky. Now, I do not know that this is going to continue, and I have no way of predicting what could happen. What I am tremendously concerned about, and I must say I'm beside myself over this, is the almost dismissive attitude people have, certain people in leadership roles have, when the possibility of a nuclear use followed by escalation is brought up. It's like they're not thinking about it. It's like they're not thinking at all. And that is different from what I have seen in the decades up to now. People have had an extraordinarily healthy fear of anything going wrong with regard to nuclear weapons. And at this time, I get the sense that it's not there or not as strong. And that, to me, leads me to a concern. I won't say I know, a concern that the chances of a nuclear accident are far greater now than they have been in the past. But hopefully I'm wrong, because I really don't know. On the matter of biological weapons, that's an extraordinarily complex question that I'm honestly am not prepared to talk about now. So I'll stay away from that subject, although I will say that biological weapons pose a serious potential problem. And you may want to think about having someone like Jeffrey Sachs on the business of COVID, because he discovered some things about what appears to be laboratory experiments that may have led to the COVID pandemic. And so Jeffrey would be a good person to talk to, but I would not claim expertise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and in fact, EIR has interviewed Jeffrey Sachs on a number of topics, and quite relevant. One could almost say on this question of the unawareness of the extreme danger, the unwillingness to look, that another form of an early warning system is the political early warning system of meetings such as this and everything that we can generate and move to make sure that the world is aware at least of what's going on. And that's, I would argue, at least as important as the military technical strategic warning system, because without that, the other is not going to take effect. That would be one of my reflections on the very scary remarks, which you just added to your already very scary remarks, which is understandably your proper intention. I believe that Colonel Corvez is no longer connected, but let me see if either Professor Schreiber or Colonel Bosshard have something to say before we turn to Helga for closing remarks. Okay, Helga, the floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank both the presenters, but also the participants, because I think the totality of what was presented is really something every responsible politician should know. So I would like to add to my thanking you the urgent appeal that you help us to bring the proceedings of this session of the IPC, which was actually the 1-year anniversary session. And I'm sure that we will make a shorter version, maybe of half an hour or 1 hour, but also the totality of it, and really try to get it to all parliamentarians of the country you are in, other elected officials, other institutions, because I think this is absolutely invaluable to hear it in that clear form. So I would really urge you to make a commitment to get it out, and also multiply. I mean, I think we had larger numbers this time, But I still think we need to reach out to connect all the different groupings and really get a mass mobilization in light of what could really go out of control in a very short period of time. Now, on the question which was raised earlier about why are the Europeans so servile in bending over to what the questioner asked as imperialism, US imperialism. Well, I think it's in February 22, Chancellor Scholz said that he would not participate in any weapons and so forth. This was even before the special military operation started, because it would lead to World War III. He said it very publicly. Then, step by step, first, no light weapons, only helmets, then light weapons, then ammunition, then Leopard tanks, then, and now it's basically let the Ukrainians use all these weapon systems. So it's an escalation. Step by step, we are getting closer to crossing the red lines. And I mean, nobody knows exactly when Russia feels that the final red line has been crossed. But I think we are really so absolutely in danger that I can only appeal to all of you to help us build this movement in a real peace movement internationally. And as Professor Boyd Barrett correctly reminded us, it is not enough to have a European new security architecture, because it would not solve the geopolitical confrontation. I think what we need is a new global security and development architecture, which indeed takes into account every country: Iran, North Korea, Israel, Palestine, the United States, China, Russia. And if you don't make that mental jump to agree that given the complexity of the world today, we cannot find a solution on a side order. It has to address the totality. And I think it can be done. The Peace of Westphalia Conference is a very good historical reference. I have proposed since the beginning of this war 10 principles, or a little bit later, 10 principles which absolutely must be discussed and solved at such a conference. And naturally, many other points can and will be added as the negotiations proceed. And I also want to thank especially Ibrahim, because what you said in terms of the change in the mental outlook, the mentality, is the key for us to succeed. Because only if we replace this stupid, geopolitical, running with the head through the wall, regarding other countries as enemies, which are not. I mean, there's a German proverb which says, it comes back as an echo from the woods in the same way as you are yelling into the woods. And that is exactly what is happening, because, all the countries of the global south are not aggressive, they are not imperialist, and they would cooperate with the West very, very easily if, we would respond to offers coming from, like Lula right now in China on the Ukraine peace plan, and many other, the whole proposals by Xi Jinping for a global security initiative, a global development initiative, and a global civilizational initiative. This is very close to what we say, because we always said we need a new world economic order which allows for the development of all countries and all nations, but that has to be combined with the renaissance of the best cultures and traditions of all nations on this planet. And especially your formulation, that we are a microcosm, and, the world at large is the macrocosm, which only can function if all the microcosms can develop and regard it as their self-interest to develop the other one. And that is the kind of world we have to build. And that can be done. Anybody who says this is a utopian conception basically agrees, that we will end up in annihilating civilization with a cold winter following a global nuclear war. And that is not an acceptable proposition, because it would mean that all the efforts of humanity of generations and generations would have been all for nothing. And that I cannot accept as an outcome of history. So I appeal to you, mobilize whatever agape, Christian charity, love, passion for humanity you can mobilize and help us to, get the world on a different track. I have discussed and others have discussed this idea of a global security and development architecture with many forces already, international organizations, universities, think tanks. And I think if we would just have a series of such discussion platforms where scholars and wise men and women from all over the world would get together and discuss how can we give ourselves an order which makes it possible that we long-term survive as a human species, I'm absolutely think that it can be done, provided that enough people are mobilizing together with us. So please go out and get the message of today out as widely as you can.